The Maine Woods by Henry David Thoreau. Book 2, Chesuncook. At 5 p.m., September 13th, 1853, I left Boston in the steamer for Bangor by the outside course. It was a warm and still night, warmer probably on the water than on the land, and the sea was as smooth as a small lake in summer, merely rippled. The passengers went singing on the deck as in a parlor till 10 o'clock. We passed a vessel on her beam ends on a rock just outside the islands, and some of us thought that she was the rapt ship, which ran, quote, on her side so low that she drank water and her keel plowed air, unquote, not considering that there was no wind and that she was under bare poles. Now we have left the islands behind and are off Nahant. We behold those features which the discoverers saw, apparently unchanged. Now we see the Cape Ann lights, and now pass near a small village-like fleet of mackerel fishers, at anchor, probably off Gloucester. They salute us with a shout from their low decks, but I understand their "good evening" to mean, "Don't run against me, sir." From the wonders of the deep we go below to yet deeper sleep, and then the absurdity of being waked up in the night by a man who wants the job of blacking your boots. It is more inevitable that seasickness and may have something to do with it. It is like the ducking you get on crossing the line the first time. I trusted that these old customs were abolished. They might, with the same propriety, insist on blacking your face. I heard of one man who complained that somebody had stolen his boots in the night, and when he found them, he wanted to know what they had done to them. They had spoiled them. He never put that stuff on them, and the bootblack narrowly escaped paying damages. Anxious to get out of the whale's belly, I rose early and joined some old salts who were smoking by a dim light on a sheltered part of the deck. We were just getting into the river. They knew all about it, of course. I was proud to find that I had stood the voyage so well and was not in the least digested. We brushed up and watched the first signs of dawn through an open port, but the day seemed to hang fire. We inquired the time. None of my companions had a chronometer. At length an African prince rushed by, observing, "12 o'clock, gentlemen," and blew out the light. It was moonrise, so I slunk down into the monster's bowels again. The first land we make is Monhegan Island, before dawn, and next St. George's Island, seeing 2 or 3 lights. Whitehead, with its bare rocks and funeral bell, is interesting. Next, I remember that the Camden Hills attracted my eyes, and afterward the hills about Frankfurt. We reached Bangor about noon. When I arrived, my companion that was to be had gone upriver and engaged an Indian, Joe Etienne, a son of the governor, to go with us to Chesuncook Lake. Joe had conducted 2 white men a moose hunting in the same direction the year before. He arrived by cars at Bangor that evening with his canoe and a companion, Sabattis Solomon, who was going to leave Bangor the following Monday with Joe's father by way of the Penobscot and join Joe in moose hunting at Chesuncook when we had done with him. They took supper at my friend's house and lodged in his barn, saying that they should fare worse than that in the woods. They only made Watch bark a little when they came to the door in the night for water, for he does not like Indians. The next morning Joe and his canoe were put on board the stage for Moosehead Lake, 60 and odd miles distant, an hour before we started in an open wagon. We carried hard bread, pork, smoked beef, tea, sugar, etc., seemingly enough for a regiment, the sight of which brought together reminded me by what ignoble means we had maintained our ground hitherto. We went by Avenue Road, which is quite straight and very good, northwestward toward Moosehead Lake, through more than a dozen flourishing towns, with almost every one its academy, not one of which, however, is on my general atlas, published, alas, in 1824, so much are they before the age or I behind it. The earth must have been considerably lighter to the shoulders of General Atlas then. It rained all this day until the middle of the next afternoon, concealing the landscape almost entirely, but we had hardly got out of the streets of Bangor before I began to be exhilarated by the sight of the wild fir and spruce tops and those of other primitive evergreens peering through the mist in the horizon. It was like the sight and odor of cake to a schoolboy. He who rides and keeps the beaten track studies the fences chiefly. Near Bangor, the fence posts, on account of the frost heaving them in the clay soil, were not planted in the ground, but were mortised into a transverse horizontal beam lying on the surface. Afterwards, the prevailing fences were log ones, with sometimes a Virginia fence, or else rails slanted over cross stakes, and these zigzagged or played leapfrog all the way to the lake, keeping just ahead of us. After getting out of the Penobscot Valley, the country was unexpectedly level, or consisted of very even and equal swells, for 20 or 30 miles, never rising above the general level, but affording, it said, a very good prospect in clear weather, with frequent views of Katahdin, straight roads, and long hills. The houses were far apart, commonly small and of one story, but framed. There was very little land under cultivation, yet the forest did not often border the road. The stumps were frequently as high as one's head, showing the depth of the snows. The white haycaps drawn over small stacks of beans or corn in the fields on account of the rain were a novel sight to me. We saw large flocks of pigeons, and several times came within a rod or two of partridges in the road. My companion said that in one journey out of Bangor he and his son had shot 60 partridges from his buggy. The mountain ash was now very handsome, as also the wayfarer's tree or hobblebush with its ripe purple berries mixed with red. The Canada thistle, an introduced plant, was the prevailing weed all the way to the lake. The roadside in many places in fields not long cleared, being densely filled with it as with a crop, to the exclusion of everything else. There were also whole fields of ferns, now rusty and withering, which in older countries are commonly confined to wet ground. There were very few flowers, even allowing for the lateness of the season. It chanced that I saw no asters in bloom along the road for 50 miles, though they were so abundant then in Massachusetts. Except in one place 1 or 2 of the aster acuminatus, and no goldenrods till within 20 miles of Monson, where I saw a 3-ribbed one. There were many late buttercups, however, and the 2 fireweeds, Erichthydes and Epilobium, commonly where there had been a burning, and at last the pearly everlasting. I noticed occasionally very long troughs, which supplied the road with water, and my companion said that $3 annually were granted by the state to one man in each school district who provided and maintained a suitable water trough by the roadside for the use of travelers, a piece of intelligence as refreshing to me as the water itself. That legislature did not sit in vain. It was an oriental act which made me wish that I was still farther down east, another Maine law which I hoped we may get in Massachusetts. That state is banishing bar rooms from its highway and conducting the mountain springs thither. The country was first, decidedly mountainous in Garland, Sangerville, and onwards, 25 or 30 miles from Bangor. At Sangerville, where we stopped at mid-afternoon to warm and dry ourselves, the landlord told us that he had found a wilderness where we found him. At a fork in the road between Abbott and Monson, about 20 miles from Moosehead Lake, I saw a guidepost surmounted by a pair of moose horns, spreading 4 or 5 feet, with the word Monson painted on one blade and the name of some other town on another. They are sometimes used for ornamental hat trees, together with deer horns, in front entries. But after the experience which I shall relate, I trust that I shall have a better excuse for killing a moose than that I may hang my hat on his horns. We reached Monson, 50 miles from Bangor and 13 from the lake, after dark. At 4 o'clock the next morning, in the dark and still in the rain, we pursued our journey. Close to the academy in this town, they have erected a sort of gallows for the pupils to practice on. I thought that they might as well hang at once all who need to go through such exercises in so new a country, where there is nothing to hinder their living an outdoor life. Better omit Blair and take the air. The country about the south end of the lake is quite mountainous, and the road began to feel the effects of it. There is one hill which it is calculated it takes 25 minutes to ascend. In many places the road was in that condition called repaired, having just been whittled into the required semi-cylindrical form with the shovel and scraper, with all the softest inequalities in the middle, like a hog's back with the bristles up, and Jehu was expected to keep astride of the spine. As you looked off each side of the bare sphere into the horizon, the ditches were awful to behold, a vast hollowness, like that between Saturn and his ring. At a tavern hereabouts, the hostler greeted our horse as an old acquaintance, though he did not remember the driver. He said that he had taken care of that little mare for a short time, a year or two before, at the Mount Kineo house, and thought she was not in as good condition as then. Every man to his trade. I am not acquainted with a single horse in the world, not even the one that kicked me. Already we had thought we saw Moosehead Lake from a hilltop where an extensive fog filled the distant lowlands, but we were mistaken. It was not till we were within a mile or two of its south end that we got our first view of it, a suitably wild-looking sheet of water sprinkled with small, low islands, which were covered with shaggy spruce and other wildwood, seen over the infant port of Greenville, with mountains on each side and far in the north, and a steamer's smoke pipe rising above a roof. A pair of moose horns ornamented a corner of the public house where we left our horse, and a few rods distant lay the small steamer Moosehead, Captain King. There was no village and no summer road any farther in this direction, but a winter road, that is, one passable only when deep snow covers its inequalities, from Greenville up the east side of the lake to Lily Bay, about 12 miles. I was here first introduced to Joe. He had ridden all the way on the outside of the stage the day before, in the rain, giving way to ladies, and was well wetted. As it still rained, he asked if we were going to put it through. He was a good-looking Indian, 24 years old, apparently of unmixed blood, short and stout, with a broad face and reddish complexion and eyes. methinks narrower and more turned up at the outer corners than ours, answering to the description of his race. Beside his underclothing he wore a red flannel shirt, woolen pants, and a black cassock hat, the ordinary dress of the lumberman, and to a considerable extent of the Penobscot Indian. When afterward he had occasion to take off his shoes and stockings, I was struck with the smallness of his feet. He had worked a good deal as a lumberman, and appeared to identify himself with that class. He was the only one of the party who possessed an India rubber jacket. The top strip or edge of his canoe was worn nearly through by friction on the stage. At 8 o'clock, the steamer, with her bell and whistles, scaring the moose, summoned us on board. She was a well-appointed little boat, commanded by a gentlemanly captain, with patent life seats and metallic lifeboat, and dinner on board if you wish. She is chiefly used by lumberers for the transportation of themselves, their boats, and supplies, but also by hunters and tourists. There was another steamer named Amphitrite, laid up close by, but apparently her name was not more trite than her hull. There were also 2 or 3 large sailboats in port. These beginnings of commerce on a lake in the wilderness are very interesting, these larger white birds that come to keep company with the gulls. There were but few passengers, and not one female among them. A St. Francis Indian, with his canoe and moose hides, 2 explorers for lumber, 3 men who landed at Sandbar Island, and a gentleman who lives on Deer Island, 11 miles up the lake, and owns also Sugar Island, between which and the former the steamer runs. These, I think, were all beside ourselves. In the saloon was some kind of musical instrument, cherubim or seraphim, to soothe the angry waves, and there, very properly, was tacked up the map of the public lands of Maine and Massachusetts, a copy of which I had in my pocket. The heavy rain confining us to the saloon a while, I discoursed with the proprietor of Sugar Island on the condition of the world in Old Testament times. But at length, leaving this subject as fresh as we found it, he told me that he had lived about this lake 20 or 30 years, and yet had not been to the head of it for 21 years. He faces the other way. The explorers had a fine new birch on board, larger than ours, in which they had come up the Piscataquis from Howland, and they had had several messes of trout already. They were going to the neighborhood of Eagle and Chamberlain lakes, or the headwaters of the St. John, and offered to keep us company as far as we went. The lake today was rougher than I found the ocean, either going or returning, and Joe remarked that it would swamp his birch. Off Lily Bay it is a dozen miles wide, but it is not much broken by islands. The scenery is not merely wild, but varied and interesting. Mountains were seen, farther or nearer on all sides but the northwest, their summits now lost in the clouds. But Mount Kineo is the principal feature of the lake, and more exclusively belongs to it. After leaving Greenville at the foot, which is the nucleus of a town some 8 or 10 years old, you see but 3 or 4 houses for the whole length of the lake, or about 40 miles. 3 of them, the public houses at which the steamer is advertised to stop, and the shore is an unbroken wilderness. The prevailing wood seemed to be spruce, fir, birch, and rock maple. You could easily distinguish the hardwood from the soft, or black growth, as it is called at a great distance, the former being smooth, round-topped, and light green, with a bowery and cultivated look. Mount Kineo, at which the boat touched, is a peninsula with a narrow neck about midway the lake on the east side. The celebrated precipice is on the east or land side of this, and is so high and perpendicular that you can jump from the top many hundred feet into the water which makes up behind the point. A man on board told us that an anchor had been sunk 90 fathoms at its base before reaching bottom. Probably it will be discovered ere long that some Indian maiden jumped off it for love once, for true love never could have found a path more to its mind. We passed quite close to the rock here, since it is a very bold shore, and I observed marks of a rise of 4 or 5 feet on it. The St. Francis Indian expected to take in his boy here, but he was not at the landing. The father's sharp eyes, however, detected a canoe with his boy in it far away under the mountain, though no one else could see it. "Where is the canoe?" asked the captain. "I don't see it." But he held on, nevertheless, and by it hove in sight. We reached the head of the lake about noon. The weather had, in the meanwhile, cleared up, though the mountains were still capped with clouds. Seen from this point, Mount Kineo and 2 other allied mountains ranging with it northeasterly presented a very strong family likeness, as if all cast in one mold. The steamer here approached a long pier projecting from the northern wilderness, and built of some of its logs, and whistled where not a cabin nor a mortal was to be seen. The shore was quite low, with flat rocks on it, overhung with black ash, arbor vitae, etc., which at first looked as if they did not care a whistle for us. There was not a single cabman to cry "Coach!" or inveigle us to the United States Hotel. At length, a Mr. Hinckley, who has a camp at the other end of the carry, appeared with a truck drawn by an ox and a horse over a rude log railway through the woods. The next thing was to get our canoe and effects over the carry from this lake, one of the heads of the Kennebec, into the Penobscot River. This railway from the lake to the river occupied the middle of a clearing 2 or 3 rods wide and perfectly straight through the forest. We walked across while our baggage was drawn behind. My companion went ahead to be ready for partridges, while I followed, looking at the plants. This was an interesting botanical locality for one coming from the south to commence with, for many plants which are rather rare, and 1 or 2 which are not found at all in the eastern part of Massachusetts, grew abundantly between the rails, as Labrador tea, Kalmia glauca, Canada blueberry, which was still in fruit and a second time in bloom, Clintonia and Linnea borealis, which last a lumberer called moxon, creeping snowberry, painted trillium, large-flowered bellwort, etc. I fancied that the aster radula, Diplopappus umbellatus, Solidago lanceolatus, red trumpet weed, and many others were conspicuously in bloom on the shore of the lake and on the carry, had a peculiarly wild and primitive look there. The spruce and fir trees crowded to the track on each side to welcome us. The arbor vitae, with its changing leaves, prompted us to make haste, and the sight of the canoe birch gave us spirits to do so. Sometimes an evergreen just fallen lay across the track with its rich burden of cones, looking still fuller of life than our trees in the most favorable positions. You did not expect to find such spruce trees in the wild woods, but they evidently attend to their toilets each morning even there. Through such a front yard did we enter that wilderness. There was a very slight rise above the lake, the country appearing like, and perhaps being partly a swamp, and at length a gradual descent to the Penobscot, which I was surprised to find here a large stream, from 12 to 15 rods wide, flowing from west to east, or at right angles with the lake, and not more than 2.5 miles from it. The distance is nearly twice too great on the map of the public lands and on Colton's map of Maine, and Russell Stream is placed too far down. Jackson makes Moosehead Lake to be 960 feet above high water in Portland Harbor. It is higher than Chesuncook, for the lumberers consider the Penobscot, where we struck it, 25 feet lower than Moosehead, though 8 miles above it is said to be the highest, so that the water can be made to flow either way, and the river falls a good deal between here and Chesuncook. The Carey man called this about 140 miles above Bangor by the river, or 200 from the ocean, and 50 miles below Hilton's on the Canada Road, the first clearing above, which is 4.5 miles from the source of the Penobscot. At the north end of the Carey, in the midst of a clearing of 60 acres or more, there was a log camp of the usual construction, with something more like a house adjoining, for the accommodation of the Carey man's family and passing lumberers. The bed of withered fir twigs smelled very sweet, though really very dirty. There was also a storehouse on the bank of the river, containing pork, flour, iron, Bateau, and birches locked up. We now proceeded to get our dinner, which always turned out to be tea, and to pitch canoes, for which purpose a large iron pot lay permanently on the bank. This we did in company with the explorers. Both Indians and whites use a mixture of rosin and grease for this purpose, that is, for the pitching, not the dinner. Joe took a small brand from the fire and blew the heat and flame against the pitch on his birch, and so melted and spread it. Sometimes he put his mouth over the suspected spot and sucked, to see if it admitted air. And at one place where we stopped, he set his canoe high on cross stakes and poured water into it. I narrowly watched his motions and listened attentively to his observations, for we had employed an Indian mainly that I might have an opportunity to study his ways. I heard him swear once mildly during this operation about his knife being as dull as a hoe, an accomplishment which he owed to his intercourse with the whites, and he remarked, quote, "We ought to have some tea before we start. We shall be hungry before we kill that moose," unquote. At mid-afternoon we embarked on the Penobscot. Our birch was 19.5 feet long by 2.5 at the widest part, and 14 inches deep within, both ends alike and painted green, which Joe thought affected the pitch and made it leak. This, I think, was a middling-sized one. That of the explorers was much larger, though probably not much longer. This carried us 3 with our baggage, weighing in all between 550 and 600 pounds. We had 2 heavy, though slender, rock maple paddles, one of them of bird's-eye maple. Joe placed birch bark on the bottom for us to sit on, and slanted cedar splints against the crossbars to protect our backs, while he himself sat upon a crossbar in the stern. The baggage occupied the middle or widest part of the canoe. We also paddled by turns in the bows, now sitting with our legs extended, now sitting upon our legs, and now rising upon our knees. But I found none of these positions endurable, and was reminded of the complaints of the old Jesuit missionaries of the torture they endured from long confinement in constrained positions in canoes in their long voyages from Quebec to the Huron country. But afterwards I sat on the crossbars, or stood up, and experienced no inconvenience. It was dead water for a couple of miles. The river had been raised about 2 feet by the rain, and lumberers were hoping for a flood sufficient to bring down the logs that were left in the spring. Its banks were 7 or 8 feet high and densely covered with white and black spruce, which I think must be the commonest tree thereabouts. Fir, arborvitae, canoe, yellow and black birch, rock, mountain, and a few red maples, beech, black and mountain ash, and large-toothed aspen, many civil-looking elms, now embrowned along the stream, and at first a few hemlocks also. We had not gone far before I was startled by seeing what I thought was an Indian encampment covered with a red flag on the bank, and exclaimed, "Camp!" to my comrades. I was slow to discover that it was a red maple changed by the frost. The immediate shores were also densely covered with the speckled alder, red osier, shrubby willows or sallows, and the like. There were a few yellow lily pads still left, half drowned along the sides, and sometimes a white one. Many fresh tracks of moose were visible where the water was shallow and on the shore, and the lily stems were freshly bitten off by them. After paddling about 2 miles, we parted company with the explorers and turned up Lobster Stream, which comes in on the right from the southeast. This was 6 or 8 rods wide and appeared to run nearly parallel with the Penobscot. Joe said that it was so called from small freshwater lobsters found in it. It is the Mattahumkeag of the maps. My companion wished to look for moose signs, and intended, if it proved worth the while, to camp up that way, since the Indian advised it. On account of the rise of the Penobscot, the water ran up this stream quite to the pond of the same name, 1 or 2 miles. The Spencer Mountains, east of the north end of Moosehead Lake, were now in plain sight in front of us. The kingfisher flew before us, the pigeon woodpecker was seen and heard, and nuthatches and chickadees close at hand. Joe said that they called the chickadee Kakuna Lesu in his language. I will not vouch for the spelling of what possibly was never spelt before, but I pronounced after him till he said it would do. We passed close to a woodcock which stood perfectly still on the shore, with feathers puffed up as if sick. This, Joe said they called Nipsqua Cohassus. The kingfisher was Skuskamonsuk, bear was Wassus, Indian devil Lunxus, the mountain ash Upasis. This was very abundant and beautiful. Moose tracks were not so fresh along this stream, except in a small creek about a mile up it, where a large log had lodged in the spring, marked W. Cross Girdle Crow Foot. We saw a pair of moose horns on the shore, and I asked Joe if a moose had shed them, but he said there was a head attached to them, and I knew that they did not shed their heads more than once in their lives. After ascending about 1.5 miles to within a short distance of Lobster Lake, we returned to the Penobscot. Just below the mouth of the Lobster, we found quick water, and the river expanded to 20 or 30 rods in width. The moose tracks were quite numerous and fresh here. We noticed in a great many places narrow and well-trodden paths by which they had come down to the river, and where they had slid on the steep and clay bank. Their tracks were either close to the edge of the stream, those of the calves distinguishable from the other, or in shallow water, the holes made by their feet in the soft bottom being visible for a long time. They were particularly numerous where there was a small bay, or Pokey Logan, as it is called, bordered by a strip of meadow or separated from the river by a low peninsula covered with coarse grass, wool grass, etc., wherein they had waded back and forth and eaten the pads. We detected the remains of one in such a spot. At one place, where we landed to pick up a summer duck, which my companion had shot, Joe peeled a canoe birch for bark for his hunting horn. He then asked if we were not going to get the other duck, for his sharp eyes had seen another fall in the bushes a little farther along, and my companion obtained it. I now began to notice the bright red berries of the tree cranberry, which grows 8 or 10 feet high, mingled with the alders and cornel along the shore. There was less hardwood than at first. After proceeding 1.75 miles below the mouth of the Lobster, we reached about sundown a small island at the head of what Joe called the Moosehorn Dead Water. The Moosehorn, in which he was going to hunt that night, coming in about 3 miles below, and on the upper end of this we decided to camp. On a point at the lower end lay the carcass of a moose killed a month or more before. We concluded merely to prepare our camp and leave our baggage here, that all might be ready when we returned from moose hunting. Though I had not come a-hunting, and felt some compunctions about accompanying the hunters, I wished to see a moose near at hand, and was not sorry to learn how the Indian managed to kill one. I went as reporter or chaplain to the hunters, and the chaplain has been known to carry a gun himself. After clearing a small space amid the dense spruce and fir trees, we covered the damp ground with a shingling of fir twigs, and while Joe was preparing his birch horn and pitching his canoe, for this had to be done whenever we stopped long enough to build a fire, and was the principal labor which he took upon himself at such times. We collected fuel for the night, large, wet, and rotting logs, which had lodged at the head of the island, for our hatchet was too small for effective chopping. But we did not kindle a fire, lest the moose should smell it. Joe set up a couple of forked stakes and prepared 6 poles, ready to cast one of our blankets over in case it rained in the night, which precaution, however, was omitted the next night. We also plucked the ducks which had been killed for breakfast. While we were thus engaged in the twilight, we heard faintly from far down the stream what sounded like 2 strokes of a woodchopper's axe echoing dully through the grim solitude. We are wont to liken many sounds heard at a distance in the forest to the stroke of an axe, because they resemble each other under those circumstances, and that is the one we commonly hear there. When we told Joe of this, he exclaimed, "By George, I'll bet that was a moose. They make a noise like that." These sound effects affected us strangely, and by their very resemblance to a familiar one, where they probably had so different an origin, enhanced the impression of solitude and wildness. At starlight, we dropped down the stream, which was a dead water for 3 miles, or as far as the Moosehorn. Joe telling us that we must be very silent, and he himself making no noise with his paddle, while he urged the canoe along with effective impulses. It was a still night, and suitable for this purpose, for if there is wind, the moose will smell you, and Joe was very confident that he should get some. The harvest moon had just risen, and its level rays began to light up the forest on our right, while we glided downward in the shade on the same side, against the little breeze that was stirring. The lofty, spiring tops of the spruce and fir were very black against the sky, and more distinct than by day, close bordering this broad avenue on each side, and the beauty of the scene as the moon rose above the forest, it would not be easy to describe. A bat flew over our heads, and we heard a few faint notes of birds from time to time, perhaps the myrtle bird for one, or the sudden plunge of a musquash, or saw one crossing the stream before us, or heard the sound of a rill emptying in, swollen by the recent rain. About a mile below the island, when the solitude seemed to be growing more complete every moment, we suddenly saw the light and heard the crackling of a fire on the bank, and discovered the camp of the two explorers, they standing before it in their red shirts and talking aloud of the adventures and profits of the day. They were just then speaking of a bargain in which, as I understood, somebody had cleared $25. We glided by without speaking, close under the bank within a couple of rods of them, and Joe, taking his horn, imitated the call of the moose till we suggested that they might fire on us. This was the last we saw of them, and we never knew whether they detected or suspected us. I have often wished since that I was with them. They search for timber over a given section, climbing hills and often high trees to look off, explore the streams by which it is to be driven, and the like. Spend 5 or 6 weeks in the woods, they two alone, 100 miles or more from any town, roaming about and sleeping on the ground where night overtakes them, depending chiefly on the provisions they carry with them, though they do not decline what game they came across, and then in the fall they return and make report to their employers, determining the number of teams that will be required the following winter. Experienced men get $3 or $4 a day for this work. It is a solitary and adventurous life, and comes nearest to that of the trapper of the West, perhaps. They work ever with a gun as well as an axe, let their beards grow, and live without neighbors, not on an open plain, but far within a wilderness. This discovery accounted for the sounds which we had heard, and destroyed the prospect of seeing moose yet a while. At length, when we had left the explorers far behind, Joe laid down his paddle, drew forth his birch horn, a straight one, about 15 inches long and 3 or 4 wide at the mouth, tied round with strips of the same bark, and standing up, imitated the call of the moose. Ugh, 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 or ooh, 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 and then a prolonged ooh, and listened attentively for several minutes. We asked him what kind of noise he expected to hear. He said that if a moose heard it, he guessed we should find out. We should hear him coming half a mile off. He would come close to, perhaps into, the water, and my companion must wait till he got fair sight, and then aim just behind the shoulder. The moose venture out to the riverside to feed and drink at night. Earlier in the season, the hunters do not use a horn to call them out, but steal upon them as they are feeding along the sides of the stream, and often the first notice they have of one is the sound of the water dropping from its muzzle. An Indian whom I heard imitate the voice of the moose, and also that of the caribou and the deer, using a much longer horn than Joe's, told me that the first could be heard 8 or 10 miles. Sometimes it was a loud sort of bellowing sound, clearer and more sonorous than the lowing of a cattle. The caribou's a sort of snort, and the small deer's like that of a lamb. At length we turned up the moose horn, where the Indians at the carry had told us that they killed a moose the night before. This is a very meandering stream, only a rod or 2 in width, but comparatively deep, coming in on the right, fitly enough named Moosehorn, whether from its windings or its inhabitants. It was bordered here and there by narrow meadows between the stream and the endless forest, affording favorable places for the moose to feed and to call them out on. We proceeded half a mile up this, as through a narrow, winding canal, where the tall, dark spruce and firs and arbor vitae towered on both sides in the moonlight, forming a perpendicular forest edge of great height, like the spires of a Venus in the forest. In two places stood a small stack of hay on the bank, ready for the lumberer's use in the winter, looking strange enough there. We thought of the day when this might be a brook winding through smooth-shaven meadows on some gentleman's grounds, and seen by moonlight then, excepting the forest that now hems it in, how little changed it would appear. Again and again Joe called the moose, placing the canoe close by some favorable point of meadow for them to come out on, but listened in vain to hear one coming rushing through the woods, and concluded that they had been hunted too much thereabouts. We saw, many times, what to our imaginations looked like a gigantic moose, with his horns peering from out the forest edge, but we saw the forest only, and not its inhabitants that night. So, at last, we turned about. There was now a little fog on the water, though it was a fine, clear night above. There were very few sounds to break the stillness of the forest. Several times we heard the hooting of a great horned owl, as at home, and told Joe that he would call out the moose for him, for he made a sound considerably like a horn. But Joe answered that the moose had heard that sound 1,000 times and knew better. And oftener still we were startled by the plunge of a musquash. Once, when Joe had called again and we were listening for moose, we heard come faintly echoing or creeping from far through the moss-clad aisles, a dull, dry, rushing sound with a solid core to it. Yet as it half smothered under the grasp of the luxuriant and fungus-like forest, like the shutting of a door in some distant entry of the damp and shaggy wilderness. If we had not been there, no mortal had heard it. When we asked Joe in a whisper what it was, he answered, "Tree fall." There is something singularly grand and impressive in the sound of a tree falling in a perfectly calm night like this, as if the agencies which overthrow it did not need to be excited, but worked with a subtle, deliberate, and conscious force like a boa constrictor, and more effectively than even in a windy day. If there is any such difference, perhaps it is because trees, with the dews of the night on them, are heavier than by day. Having reached the camp, about 10 o'clock, we kindled our fire and went to bed. Each of us had a blanket in which he lay on the fir twigs, with his extremities toward the fire, but nothing over his head. It was worth the while to lie down in a country where you could afford such great fires. That was one whole side, and the bright side, of our world. We had first rolled up a large log some 18 inches through and 10 feet long for a back log, to last all night, and then piled on the trees to the height of 3 or 4 feet, no matter how green or damp. In fact, we burned as much wood that night as would, with economy and an airtight stove, last a poor family in one of our cities all winter. It was very agreeable, as well as independent, thus lying in the open air, and the fire kept our uncovered extremities warm enough. The Jesuit missionaries used to say that in their journeys with the Indians in Canada, they lay on a bed which had never been shaken up since the creation, unless by earthquakes. It is surprising with what impunity and comfort one who has always lain in a warm bed in a close apartment, and studiously avoided draughts of air, can lie down on the ground without shelter, roll himself in a blanket, and sleep before a fire in a frosty autumn night, just after a long rainstorm, and even come soon to enjoy and value the fresh air. I lay awake a while, watching the ascent of the sparks through the firs, and sometimes their descent in half-extinguished cinders on my blanket. They were as interesting as fireworks, going up in endless, successive crowds, each after an explosion in an eager, serpentine course, some to 5 or 6 rods above tree-tops before they went out. We do not suspect how much our chimneys have concealed, and now airtight stoves have come to conceal all the rest. In the course of the night I got up once or twice and put fresh logs on the fire, making my companions curl up their legs. When we awoke in the morning, Saturday, September 17th, there was considerable frost whitening the leaves. We heard the sound of the chickadee and a few faintly lisping birds, and also of ducks in the water about the island. I took a botanical account of stock of our domains before the dew was off, and found that the ground hemlock or American yew was the prevailing undershrub. We breakfasted on tea, hard bread, and ducks. Before the fog had fairly cleared away, we paddled down the stream again, and were soon past the mouth of the Moosehorn. These 20 miles of the Penobscot between Moosehead and Chesuncook lakes are comparatively smooth, and a great part dead water. But from time to time it is shallow and rapid, with rocks or gravel beds where you can wade across. There is no expanse of water and no break in the forest, and the meadow is a mere edging here and there. There are no hills near the river nor within sight, except 1 or 2 distant mountains seen in a few places. The banks are from 6 to 10 feet high, but once or twice rise gently to higher ground. In many places the forest on the bank was but a thin strip, letting the light through from some alder swamp or meadow behind. The conspicuous berry-bearing bushes and trees along the shore were the red osier, with its whitish fruit, hobblebush, mountain ash, tree cranberry, chokecherry, now ripe, alternate, cornel, and naked viburnum. Following Joe's example, I ate the fruit of the last, and also the hobblebush, but found them rather insipid and seedy. I looked very narrowly at the vegetation as we glided along close to the shore, and frequently made Joe turn aside for me to pluck a plant that I might see by comparison what was primitive about my native river. Horehound, horsemint, and the sensitive fern grew close to the edge under the willows and alders and wool grass on the islands, as along the Assabet River in Concord. It was too late for flowers, except a few asters, goldenrods, etc. In several places we noticed the slight frame of a camp, such as we had prepared to set up, amid the forest by the riverside, where some lumberers or hunters had passed a night, and sometimes steps cut in the muddy or clay bank in front of it. We stopped to fish for trout at the mouth of a small stream called Ragmuff, which came in from the west about 2 miles below the Moosehorn. Here were the ruins of an old lumbering camp, and a small space which had formerly been cleared and burned over was now densely overgrown with the red cherry and raspberries. While we were trying for trout, Joe, Indian-like, wandered off up the Ragmuff on his own errands, and when we were ready to start was far beyond call. So we were compelled to make a fire and get our dinner here, not to lose time. Some dark reddish birds with grayer females, perhaps purple finches, and myrtle birds in their summer dress, hopped within 6 or 8 feet of us and our smoke. Perhaps they smelled the frying pork. The latter bird, or both, made the lisping notes which I had heard in the forest. They suggested that the few small birds found in the wilderness are on more familiar terms with the lumberman and hunter than those of the orchard and clearing with the farmer. I have since found the Canada jay and partridges, both the black and the common, equally tame there, as if they had not yet learned to mistrust man entirely. The chickadee, which is at home alike in the primitive woods and in our woodlots, still retains its confidence in the towns to a remarkable degree. Joe at length returned after an hour and a half and said that he had been 2 miles up the stream exploring and had seen a moose, but not having the gun, he did not get him. We made no complaint, but concluded to look out for Joe the next time. However, this may have been a mere mistake, for we had no reason to complain of him afterwards. As we continued down the stream, I was surprised to hear him whistling "Oh, Susanna," and several other such airs while his paddle urged us along. Once he said, "Yes, sirree." His common word was "sartain." He paddled as usual on one side only, giving the birch an impulse by using the side as a fulcrum. I asked him how the ribs were fastened to the side rails. He answered, "I don't know, I never noticed." Talking with him about subsisting wholly on what the woods yielded, game, fish, berries, etc., I suggested that his ancestors did so, but he answered that he had been brought up in such a way that he could not do it. "Yes," said he, "that's the way they got a living, like wild fellows, wild as bears. By George, I shan't go into the woods without provision, hard bread, pork, etc." He had brought on a barrel of hard bread and stored it at the carry for his hunting. However, though he was a governor's son, he had not learned to read. At one place below this, on the east side, where the bank was higher and drier than usual, rising gently from the shore to a slight elevation, some one had felled the trees over 20 or 30 acres and left them drying in order to burn. This was the only preparation for a house between the Moosehead Carry and Chesuncook, but there was no hut nor inhabitants there yet. The pioneer thus selects a site for his house, which will perhaps prove the germ of a town. My eyes were all the while on the trees, distinguishing between the black and white spruce and the fir. You paddle along in a narrow canal through an endless forest, and the vision I have in my mind's eye still is of the small, dark, and sharp tops of tall fir and spruce trees and pagoda-like arborvitaes, crowded together on each side with various hardwoods intermixed. Some of the arborvitaes were at least 60 feet high. The hardwoods, occasionally occurring exclusively, were less wild to my eye. I fancied them ornamental grounds, with farmhouses in the rear. The canoe and yellow birch, beech, maple, and elm are Saxon and Norman, but the spruce and fir and pines generally are Indian. The soft engravings which adorn the annuals give no idea of a stream in such a wilderness as this. The rough sketches in Jackson's reports on the geology of Maine answer much better. At one place we saw a small grove of slender sapling white pines, the only collection of pines that I saw on this voyage. Here and there, however, was a full-grown, tall and slender but defective one, what lumbermen call a conscious tree, which they ascertain with their axes or by the knots. I did not learn whether this word was Indian or English. It reminded me of the Greek word koisia, a conch or shell, and I amused myself with fancying that it might signify the dead sound which the trees yield when struck. All the rest of the pines had been driven off. How far men go for the material of their houses! The inhabitants of the most civilized cities in all ages send into far primitive forests beyond the bounds of their civilization, where the moose and bear and savage dwell, for their pine boards for ordinary use. And on the other hand, the savage soon receives from cities iron arrow points, hatchets, and guns to point his savageness with. The solid and well-defined fir tops, like sharp and regular spearheads, black against the sky, gave a peculiar, dark, and somber look to the forest. The spruce tops have a similar but more ragged outline, their shafts also merely feathered below. The firs were somewhat oftener regular and dense pyramids. I was struck by this universal spiring upward of the forest evergreens. The tendency is to slender, spiring tops, while they are narrower below. Not only the spruce and fir, but even the arbor vitae and white pine, unlike the soft, spreading second growth, of which I saw none, all spire upwards, lifting a dense spearhead of cones to the light and air at any rate. While their branches straggle after as they may, as Indians lift the ball over the heads of the crowd in their desperate game. In this they resemble grasses, as also palms somewhat. The hemlock is commonly a tent-like pyramid from the ground to its summit. After passing through some long rips and by a large island, we reached an interesting part of the river called the Pine Stream Deadwater, about 6 miles below Ragmuff, where the river expanded to 30 rods in width and had many islands in it with elms and canoe birches, now yellowing along the shore, and we got our first sight of Katahdin. Here, about 2 o'clock, we turned up a small branch 3 or 4 rods wide, which comes in on the right from the south, called Pine Stream, to look for moose signs. We had gone but a few rods before we saw very recent signs along the water's edge, the mud lifted up by their feet being quite fresh, and Joe declared that they had gone along there but a short time before. We soon reached a small meadow on the east side at an angle in the stream, which was for the most part densely covered with alders. As we were advancing along the edge of this, rather more quietly than usual, perhaps on account of the freshness of the signs, the design being to camp up the stream, if it promised well, I heard a slight crackling of twigs deep in the alders and turned Joe's attention to it, whereupon he began to push the canoe back rapidly, and we had receded thus half a dozen rods, when we suddenly spied 2 moose standing just on the edge of the open part of the meadow which we had passed, not more than 6 or 7 rods distant, looking round the alders at us. They made me think of great frightened rabbits, with their long ears and half-inquisitive, half-frightened looks. The true denizens of the forest I saw at once, filling a vacuum which now first I discovered had not been filled for me. Moosemen, wood-eaters. The word is said to mean clad in a sort of Vermont gray or homespun. Our Nimrod, owing to the retrograde movement, was now the farthest from the game, but being warned of its neighborhood, he hastily stood up, and while we ducked, fired over our heads in one barrel at the foremost, which alone he saw, though he did not know what kind of creature it was. Whereupon this one dashed across the meadow and up a high bank on the northeast, so rapidly as to leave but an indistinct impression of its outlines on my mind. At the same instant, the other, a young one, but as tall as a horse, leaped out into the stream in full sight, and there stood cowering for a moment, or rather its disproportionate lowness behind gave it that appearance, and uttering 2 or 3 trumpeting squeaks. I have an indistinct recollection of seeing the old one pause an instant on the top of the bank in the woods, look toward its shivering young, and then dash away again. The second barrel was leveled at the calf, and when we expected to see it drop in the water after a little hesitation, it, too, got out of the water and dashed up the hill, though in a somewhat different direction. All this was the work of a few seconds, and our hunter, having never seen a moose before, did not know but they were deer, for they stood partly in the water, nor whether he had fired at the same one twice or not. From the style in which they went off, and the fact that he was not used to standing up and firing from a canoe, I judged that we should not see anything more of them. The Indians said that they were a cow and her calf, a yearling or perhaps 2 years old, for they accompanied their dams so long, but for my part I had not noticed much difference in their size. It was but 2 or 3 rods across the meadow to the foot of the bank, which, like all the world thereabouts, was densely wooded, but I was surprised to notice that as soon as the moose had passed behind the veil of the woods, there was no sound of footsteps to be heard from the soft, damp moss which carpets that forest, and long before we landed, perfect silence reigned. Joe said, "If you wound a moose, me sure get 'em." We all landed at once. My companion reloaded. The Indian fastened his birch, threw off his hat, adjusted his waistband, seized the hatchet, and set out. He told me afterward, casually, that before we landed he had seen a drop of blood on the bank when it was 2 or 3 rods off. He proceeded rapidly up the bank and through the woods with a peculiar, elastic, noiseless, and stealthy tread, looking to right and left on the ground and stepping in the faint tracks of the wounded moose, now and then pointing in silence to a single drop of blood on the handsome, shining leaves of the Clintonia borealis, which on every side covered the ground, or to a dry fern stem, freshly broken, all the while chewing some leaf or else the spruce gum. I followed, watching his motions more than the trail of the moose. After following the trail about 40 rods in a pretty direct course, stepping over fallen trees and winding between standing ones, he at length lost it, for there were many other moose tracks there, and returning once more to the last blood stain, traced it a little way and lost it again, and too soon, I thought, for a good hunter gave it up entirely. He traced a few steps also, the tracks of the calf, but seeing no blood, soon relinquished the search. I observed, while he was tracking the moose, a certain reticence or moderation in him. He did not communicate several observations of interest which he made, as a white man would have done, though they may have leaked out afterward. At another time, when he heard a slight crackling of twigs and he landed to reconnoitre, he stepped lightly and gracefully, stealing through the bushes with the least possible noise, in a way in which no white man does, as it were, finding a place for his foot each time. About half an hour after seeing the moose, we pursued our voyage up Pine Stream, and soon coming to a part which was very shoal and also rapid, we took out the baggage and proceeded to carry it round, while Joe got up with the canoe alone. We were just completing our portage, and I was absorbed in the plants, admiring the leaves of the aster macrophyllus, 10 inches wide, and plucking the seeds of the great round-leaved orchis, when Joe exclaimed from the stream that he had killed a moose. He had found the cow moose lying dead, but quite warm, in the middle of the stream, which was so shallow that it rested on the bottom, with hardly a third of its body above the water. It was about an hour after it was shot, and it was swollen with water. It had run about 100 rods and sought the stream again, cutting off a slight bend. No doubt a better hunter would have tracked it to the spot at once. I was surprised at its great size, horse-like, but Joe said it was not a large cow moose. My companion went in search of the calf again. I took hold of the ears of the moose, while Joe pushed his canoe downstream toward a favorable shore, and so we made out, though with some difficulty, its long nose frequently sticking in the bottom to drag it into still shallower water. It was a brownish-black, or perhaps a dark iron-gray, on the back and sides, but lighter beneath and in front. I took the cord which served for the canoe's painter, and with Joe's assistance measured it carefully, the greatest distances first, making a knot each time. The painter being wanted, I reduced these measures that night with equal care to lengths and fractions of my umbrella, beginning with the smallest measures and untying the knots as I proceeded, and when we arrived at Chesuncook the next day, finding a 2-foot rule there, I reduced the last to feet and inches, and moreover I made myself a 2-foot rule of a thin and narrow strip of black ash, which would fold up conveniently to 6 inches. All this pains I took because I did not wish to be obliged to say merely that the moose was very large. Of the various dimensions which I obtained, I will mention only 2. The distance from the tips of the hoofs of the 4 feet stretched out to the top of the back between the shoulders was 7 feet and 5 inches. I can hardly believe my own measure, for this is about 2 feet greater than the height of a tall horse. Indeed, I am now satisfied that this measurement was incorrect, but the other measures given here I can warrant to be correct, having proved them in a more recent visit to those woods. The extreme length was 8 feet and 2 inches. Another cow moose, which I have since measured in those woods with a tape, was just 6 feet from the tip of the hoof to the shoulders and 8 feet long as she lay. When afterward I asked an Indian at the carry how much taller the male was, he answered 18 inches, and made me observe the height of a cross stake over the fire, more than 4 feet from the ground, to give me some idea of the depth of his chest. Another Indian at Old Town told me that they were 9 feet high to the top of the back, and that one which he tried weighed 800 pounds. The length of the spinal projections between the shoulders is very great. A white hunter, who was the best authority among hunters that I could have, told me that the male was not 18 inches taller than the female. Yet he agreed that he was sometimes 9 feet high to the top of the back and weighed 1,000 pounds. Only the male has horns, and they rise 2 feet or more above the shoulders, spreading 3 or 4 and sometimes 6 feet, which would make him in all sometimes 11 feet high. According to this calculation, the moose is as tall, though it may not be as large, as the great Irish elk, Megaceros hibernicus, of a former period, of which Mantell says that it very far exceeded in magnitude any living species, the skeleton, being upward of 10 feet high from the ground to the highest point of the antlers. Joe said that though the moose shed the whole horn annually, each new horn has an additional prong. But I have noticed that they sometimes have more prongs on one side than on the other. I was struck with the delicacy and tenderness of the hoofs, which divided very far up, and the one half could be pressed very much behind the other, thus probably making the animal sure-footed on the uneven ground and slippery, moss-covered logs of the primitive forest. They were very unlike the stiff and battered feet of our horses and oxen. The bare, horny part of the forefoot was just 6 inches long, and the 2 portions could be separated 4 inches at the extremity. The moose is singularly grotesque and awkward to look at. Why should it stand so high at the shoulders? Why have so long a head? Why have no tail to speak of? For in my examination I overlooked it entirely. Naturalists say it is 1.5 inches long. It reminded me at once of the camelopard, high before and low behind, And no wonder, for like it is fitted to browse on trees. The upper lip projected 2 inches beyond the lower for this purpose. This was the kind of man that was at home there, for as near as I can learn, that has never been the residence, but rather the hunting ground of the Indian. The moose will, perhaps, one day become extinct, but how naturally then, when it exists only as a fossil relic, and unseen as that, may the poet or sculptor invent a fabulous animal with similar branching and leafy horns, a sort of fucus or lichen in bone, to be the inhabitant of such a forest as this. Here, just at the head of the murmuring rapids, Joe now proceeded to skin the moose with a pocket knife, while I looked on, and a tragical business it was, to see that still warm and palpitating body pierced with a knife, to see the warm milk stream from the rent udder, and the ghastly naked red carcass appearing from within its seemly robe, which was made to hide it. The ball had passed through the shoulder blade diagonally and lodged under the skin on the opposite side, and was partially flattened. My companion keeps it to show to his grandchildren. He has the shanks of another moose which he has since shot, skinned, and stuffed, ready to be made into boots by putting in a thick leather sole. Joe said, if a moose stood fronting you, you must not fire, but advance toward him, for he will turn slowly and give you a fair shot. In the bed of this narrow, wild, and rocky stream, between 2 lofty walls of spruce and fir, a mere cleft in the forest which the stream had made, this work went on. At length Joe had stripped off the hide and dragged it, trailing to the shore, declaring that it weighed 100 pounds, though probably 50 would have been nearer the truth. He cut off a large mass of the meat to carry along, and another together with the tongue and nose. He put with the hide on the shore to lie there all night, or till we returned. I was surprised that he thought of leaving this meat thus exposed by the side of the carcass, as the simplest course, not fearing that any creature would touch it, but nothing did. This could hardly have happened on the bank of one of our rivers in the eastern part of Massachusetts, but I suspect that fewer small wild animals are prowling there than us. Twice, however, in this excursion, I had a glimpse of a species of large mouse. This stream was so withdrawn, and the moose tracks were so fresh, that my companions, still bent on hunting, concluded to go farther up it and camp, and then hunt up or down at night. Half a mile above this, at a place where I saw the last aster puniceus and the beaked hazel as we paddled along, Joe, hearing a slight rustling amid the alders, and seeing something black about 2 rods off, jumped up and whispered, "Bear." But before the hunter had discharged his piece, he corrected himself to beaver. Hedgehog. The bullet killed a large hedgehog, more than 2 feet and 8 inches long. The quills were rayed out and flattened on the hinder part of its back, even as if it had lain on that part, but were erect and long between this and the tail. Their points, closely examined, were seen to be finely bearded or barbed, and shaped like an awl, that is, a little concave to give the barbs effect. After about a mile of still water, we prepared our camp on the right side, just at the foot of a considerable fall. Little chopping was done that night, for fear of scaring the moose. We had moose meat fried for supper. It tasted like tender beef, with perhaps more flavor, sometimes like veal. After supper, the moon having risen, we proceeded to hunt a mile up the stream first, carrying about the falls. We made a picturesque sight, wending single file along the shore, climbing over rocks and logs. Joe, who brought up the rear, twirling his canoe in his hands as if it were a feather in places where it was difficult to get along without a burden. We launched the canoe again from the ledge over which the stream fell, but after half a mile of still water, suitable for hunting, it became rapid again, and we were compelled to make our way along the shore while Joe endeavored to get up in the birch alone, though it was still very difficult for him to pick his way amid the rocks in the night. We, on the shore, found the worst of walking, a perfect chaos of fallen and drifted trees, and of bushes projecting far over the water, and now and then we made our way across the mouth of a small tributary on a kind of network of alders. So we went tumbling on in the dark, being on the shady side, effectually scaring all the moose and bears that might be thereabouts. At length we came to a standstill, and Joe went forward to reconnoitre. But he reported that it was still a continuous rapid as far as he went, or half a mile, with no prospect of improvement, as if it were coming down from a mountain. So we turned about, hunting back to the camp through the still water. It was a splendid moonlight night, and I, getting sleepy as it grew late, for I had nothing to do, found it difficult to realize where I was. This stream was much more unfrequented than the main one, lumbering operations being no longer carried on in this quarter. It was only 3 or 4 rods wide, but the firs and spruce through which it trickled seemed yet taller by contrast. Being in this dreamy state, which the moonlight enhanced, I did not clearly discern the shore, but seemed most of the time to be floating through ornamental grounds, for I associated the fir tops with such scenes, very high up some Broadway, and beneath or between their tops, I thought I saw an endless succession of porticos and columns, cornices and facades, verandas and churches. I did not merely fancy this, but in my drowsy state such was the illusion. I fairly lost myself in sleep several times, still dreaming of that architecture and the nobility that dwelt behind and might issue from it. But all at once I would be aroused and brought back to a sense of my actual position by the sound of Joe's birch horn in the midst of all this silence, calling the moose, "Ugh, ugh, ooh, ooh, ooh," and I prepared to hear a furious moose come rushing and crashing through the forest, and see him burst out onto the little strip of meadow by our side. But on more accounts than one, I had had enough of moose hunting. I had not come to the woods for this purpose, nor had I foreseen it, though I had been willing to learn how the Indian maneuvered. But one moose killed was as good, if not as bad, as a dozen. The afternoon's tragedy, and my share in it, as it affected the innocents, destroyed the pleasure of my adventure. It is true, I came as near as it possible to come to being a hunter, and I miss it myself, and as it is, I think that I could spend a year in the woods, fishing and hunting, just enough to sustain myself with satisfaction. This would be next to living like a philosopher, on the fruits of the earth which you had raised, which also attracts me. But this hunting of the moose merely for the satisfaction of killing him, not even for the sake of his hide, without making any extraordinary exertion or running any risk yourself, is too much like going out by night to some woodside pasture and shooting your neighbor's horses. These are God's own horses, poor, timid creatures, that will run fast enough as soon as they smell you, though they are 9 feet high. Joe told us of some hunters who a year or 2 before had shot down several oxen by night somewhere in the Maine woods, mistaking them for moose. And so might any of the hunters, and what is the difference in the sport but the name? In the former case, Having killed one of God's and your own oxen, you strip off its hide, because that is the common trophy, and moreover you have heard that it may be sold for moccasins. Cut a steak from its haunches, and leave the huge carcass to smell to heaven for you. It is no better, at least, than to assist at a slaughterhouse. This afternoon's experience suggested to me how base or coarse are motives which commonly carry men into the wilderness. The explorers and lumberers generally are all hirelings, paid so much a day for their labor, and as such they have no more love for wild nature than wood sawyers have for forests. Other white men and Indians who come here are for the most part hunters, whose object is to slay as many moose and other wild animals as possible. But, pray, could not one spend some weeks or years in the solitude of this vast wilderness with other employments than these, employments perfectly sweet and innocent and ennobling? For one that comes with a pencil to sketch or sing, 1,000 come with an axe or rifle. What a coarse and imperfect use Indians and hunters make of nature! No wonder that their race is so soon exterminated. I already, and for weeks afterward, felt my nature the coarser for this part of my woodland experience, and was reminded that our life should be lived as tenderly and daintily as one would pluck a flower. With these thoughts, when we reached our camping ground, I decided to leave my companions to continue moose hunting down the stream, while I prepared the camp, though they requested me not to chop much nor make a large fire, for fear I should scare their game. In the midst of the damp fir wood, high on the mossy bank, about 9 o'clock of this bright moonlight night, I kindled a fire. When they were gone, and sitting on the fir twigs within sound of the falls, examined by its light the botanical specimens which I had collected that afternoon, and wrote down some of the reflections which I have here expanded, or I walked along the shore and gazed up the stream, where the whole space above the falls was filled with mellow light. As I sat before the fire on my fir twig seat, without walls above or around me, I remembered how far on every hand that wilderness stretched, before you came to cleared or cultivated fields, and wondered if any bear or moose was watching the light of my fire, for nature looked sternly upon me on account of the murder of the moose. Strange that so few ever come to the woods to see how the pine lives and grows and spires, lifting its evergreen arms to the light, to see its perfect success. But most are content to behold it in the shape of many broad boards brought to market, and deem that its true success. But the pine is no more lumber than man is, and to be made into boards and houses is no more its true and highest use than the truest use of a man is to be cut down and made into manure. There is a higher law affecting our relation to pines as well as to men. A pine cut down, a dead pine, is no more a pine than a dead human carcass is a man. Can he who has discovered only some of the values of whalebone and whale oil be said to have discovered the true use of the whale? Can he who slays the elephant for his ivory be said to have seen the elephant? These are petty and accidental uses, just as if a stronger race were to kill us in order to make buttons or flageolets of our bones. For everything may serve a lower as well as a higher use. Every creature is better alive than dead. Men and moose and pine trees, and he who understands it aright will rather preserve its life than destroy it. Is it the lumberman, then, who is the friend and lover of the pine, stands nearest to it, and understands its nature best? Is it the tanner who has barked it, or he who has boxed it for turpentine, whom posterity will fable to have been changed into a pine at last? No, no, it is the poet. He it is who makes the truest use of the pine, who does not fondle it with an axe, nor tickle it with a saw, nor stroke it with a plane, who knows whether its heart is false without cutting into it, who has not bought the stumpage of the township on which it stands. All the pines shudder and heave a sigh when that man steps on the forest floor. No, it is the poet who loves them as his own shadow in the air and lets them stand. I have been into the lumber yard and the carpenter's shop, and the tannery, and the lampblack factory, and the turpentine clearing, but when at length I saw the tops of the pines waving and reflecting the light at a distance high over all the rest of the forest, I realized that the former were not the highest use of the pine. It is not their bones or hide or tallow that I love most. It is the living spirit of the tree, not its spirit of turpentine, with which I sympathize and which heals my cuts. It is as immortal as I am, and perchance will go to as high a heaven, there to tower above me still. Ere long the hunters returned, not having seen a moose, but in consequence of my suggestions, bringing a quarter of the dead one, which with ourselves made quite a load for the canoe. After breakfasting on moose meat, we returned down Pine Stream on our way to Chesuncook Lake, which was about 5 miles distant. We could see the red carcass of the moose lying in Pine Stream when nearly half a mile off. Just below the mouth of this stream were the most considerable rapids between the two lakes, called Pine Stream Falls, where were large flat rocks washed smooth, and at this time you could easily wade across above them. Joe ran down alone while we walked over the portage, my companion collecting spruce gum for his friends at home, and I looking for flowers. Near the lake, which we were approaching with as much expectation as if it had been a university, for it is not often that the stream of our life opens into such expansions, were islands and a low and meadowy shore with scattered trees, birches, white and yellow, slanted over the water, and maples, many of the white birches killed, apparently by inundations. There was considerable native grass, and even a few cattle, whose movements we had heard, though we did not see them, mistaking them at first for moose, were pastured there. On entering the lake, where the stream runs southeasterly, and for some time before, we had a view of the mountains about Katahdin. Katahdinaqua, one says they are called, like a cluster of blue fungi of rank growth, apparently 25 or 30 miles distant in a southeast direction, their summits concealed by clouds. Joe called some of them the Suwadanook Mountains. This is the name of a stream there, which another Indian told us meant running between mountains. Though some lower summits were afterward uncovered, we got no more complete view of Katahdin while we were in the woods. The clearing to which we were bound was on the right of the mouth of the river, and was reached by going round a low point, where the water was shallow to a great distance from the shore. Chesuncook Lake extends northwest and southeast, and is called 18 miles long and 3 wide, without an island. We had entered the northwest corner of it, and when near the shore could see only part way down it. The principal mountains visible from the land here were those already mentioned, between southeast and east, and a few summits a little west of north, but generally the north and northwest horizon about the St. John and the British boundary was comparatively level. Ansel Smith's, the oldest and principal clearing about this lake, appeared to be quite a harbor for Bateaux and canoes. 7 or 8 of the former were lying about, and there was a small scow for hay, and a capstan on a platform, now high and dry, ready to be floated and anchored to tow rafts with. It was a very primitive kind of harbor, where boats were drawn up amid the stumps. Such a one, methought, as the Argo might have been launched in. There were 5 other huts with small clearings on the opposite side of the lake, all at this end and visible from this point. One of the Smiths told me that it was so far cleared that they came here to live and build the present house 4 years before, though the family had been here but a few months. I was interested to see how a pioneer lived on this side of the country. His life is in some respects more adventurous than that of his brother in the West, for he contends with winter as well as the wilderness, and there is a greater interval of time at least between him and the army which is to follow. Here immigration is a tide which may ebb when it has swept away the pines. There it is not a tide, but an inundation, and roads and other improvements come steadily rushing after. As we approached the log house, a dozen rods from the lake, and considerably elevated above it, the projecting ends of the logs lapping over each other irregularly, several feet at the corners, gave it a very rich and picturesque look, far removed from the meanness of weatherboards. It was a very spacious, low building, about 80 feet long, with many large apartments. The walls were well clayed between the logs, which were large and round except on the upper and under sides, and as visible inside as out, successive bulging cheeks gradually lessening upwards and tuned to each other with the axe like Pandean pipes. Probably the musical forest gods had not yet cast them aside. They never do till they are split or the bark is gone. It was a style of architecture not described by Vitruvius, I suspect, though possibly hinted at in the biography of Orpheus. None of your frilled or fluted columns, which have cut such a false swell, and support nothing but a gable end and their builders' pretensions. That is with the multitude, and as for ornamentation, one of those words with a dead tail which architects very properly use to describe their flourishes, there were the lichens and mosses and fringes of bark, which nobody troubled himself about. We certainly leave the handsomest paint and clapboards behind in the woods when we strip off the bark and poison ourselves with white lead in the towns. We get but half the spoils of the forest. For beauty, give me trees with the fur on. This house was designed and constructed with the freedom of stroke of a forester's axe, without other compass and square than nature uses. Wherever the logs were cut off by a window or door, that is, were not kept in place by alternate overlapping. They were held one upon another by very large pins, driven in diagonally on each side, where branches might have been, and then cut off so close up and down as not to project beyond the bulge of the log, as if the logs clasped each other in their arms. These logs were posts, studs, boards, clapboards, lathes, plaster, and nails all in one. Where the citizen uses a mere sliver or board, the pioneer uses the whole trunk of a tree. The house had large stone chimneys and was roofed with spruce bark. The windows were imported, all but the casings. One end was a regular loggers' camp for the boarders, with the usual fir floor and log benches. Thus, this house was but a slight departure from the hollow tree, which the bear still inhabits, being a hollow made with trees piled up, with a coating of bark like its original. The cellar was a separate building, like an ice house, and it answered for a refrigerator at this season, our moose meat being kept there. It was a potato hole with a permanent roof. Each structure and institution here was so primitive that you could at once refer it to its source, but our buildings commonly suggest neither their origin nor their purpose. There was a large and what farmers would call handsome barn, part of whose boards had been sawed by a whipsaw, and the saw pit, with its great pile of dust, remained before the house. The long split shingles on a portion of the barn were laid a foot to the weather, suggesting what kind of weather they have there. Grant's barn at Caribou Lake was said to be still larger, the biggest ox nest in the woods, 50 feet by 100. Think of a monster barn in that primitive forest, lifting its gray back above the treetops. Man makes very much such a nest for his domestic animals of withered grass and fodder as the squirrels and many other wild creatures do for themselves. There was also a blacksmith's shop where plainly a good deal of work was done. The oxen and horses used in lumbering operations were shod, and all the ironwork of sleds, etc., was repaired or made here. I saw them load a bateau at the Moosehead Carry the next Tuesday with about 1,300 weight of bar iron for this shop. This reminded me how primitive and honorable a trade was Vulcan's. I do not hear that there was any carpenter or tailor among the gods. The smith seems to have preceded these and every other mechanic at Chesuncook, as well as on Olympus, and his family is the most widely dispersed, whether he be christened John or Ansel. Smith owned 2 miles down the lake by half a mile in width. There were about 100 acres cleared here. He cut 70 tons of English hay this year on this ground and 20 more on another clearing, and he uses it all himself in lumbering operations. The barn was crowded with pressed hay and a machine to press it. There was a large garden full of roots, turnips, beets, carrots, potatoes, etc., all of great size. They said that they were worth as much here as in New York. I suggested some currants for sauce, especially as they had no apple trees set out and showed how easily they could be obtained. There was the usual long-handled axe of the primitive woods by the door, 3½ feet long, for my new black ash rule was in constant use, and a large shaggy dog, whose nose, report said, was full of porcupine quills. I can testify that he looked very sober. This is the usual fortune of pioneer dogs, for they have to face the brunt of the battle for their race and act the part of Arnold Winkelried without intending it. If he should invite one of his town friends up this way, suggesting moose meat and unlimited freedom, the latter might pertinently inquire, "What is that sticking in your nose?" When a generation or two have used up all the enemy's darts, their successors lead a comparatively easy life. We owe to our fathers analogous blessings. Many old people receive pensions for no other reason, it seems to me, but as a compensation for having lived a long time. No doubt our town dogs still talk, in a snuffling way, about the days that tried dogs' noses. How they got a cat up there I do not know, for they are as shy as my aunt about entering a canoe. I wondered that she did not run up a tree on the way, but perhaps she was bewildered by the very crowd of opportunities. 20 or 30 lumberers, Yankee and Canadian, were coming and going, Aleck among the rest, and from time to time an Indian touched here. In the winter there are sometimes 100 men lodged here at once. The most interesting piece of news that circulated among them appeared to be that 4 horses belonging to Smith, worth $700, had passed by farther into the woods a week before. The white pine tree was at the bottom or farther end of all of this. It is a war against the pines, the only real Aroostook or Penobscot war. I have no doubt that they lived pretty much the same sort of life in the Homeric age, for men have always thought more of eating than of fighting. Then, as now, their minds run chiefly on the hot bread and sweet cakes, and the fur and lumber trade is an old story to Asia and Europe. I doubt if men ever made a trade of heroism. In the days of Achilles, even, they delighted in big barns, and perchance in pressed hay, and he who possessed the most valuable team was the best fellow. We had designed to go on at evening up the Chesuncook, whose mouth was a mile or 2 distant, to the lake of the same name, about 10 miles off. But some Indians of Joe's acquaintance who were making canoes on the Chesuncook came over from that side and gave so poor an account of the moose hunting, so many had been killed there lately, that my companions concluded not to go there. Joe spent this Sunday and the night with his acquaintances. The lumberers told me that there were many moose hereabouts, but no caribou or deer. A man from Old Town had killed 10 or 12 moose within a year, so near the house that they heard all his guns. His name may have been Hercules, for aught I know, though I should rather have expected to hear the rattling of his club. But, no doubt, he keeps pace with the improvements of the age and uses a Sharp's rifle now. Probably he gets all his armor made and repaired at Smith's shop. 1 moose had been killed and another shot at within sight of the house within 2 years. I do not know whether Smith has yet got a poet to look after the cattle, which, on account of the early breaking up of the ice, are compelled to summer in the woods. But I would suggest this office to such of my acquaintances as love to write verses and go a-gunning. After dinner, at which applesauce was the greatest luxury to me, but our moose meat was often called for by the lumberers, I walked across the clearing into the forest, southward, returning along the shore. For my dessert, I helped myself to a large slice of the Chesuncook woods, and took a hearty draught of its waters with all my senses. The woods were as fresh and full of vegetable life as a lichen in wet weather, and contained many interesting plants. But unless they are of white pine, they are treated with as little respect here as a mildew, and in the other case, they are only the more quickly cut down. The shore was of course flat, slate rocks, often in slabs, with the surf beating on it. The rocks and bleached drift logs, extending some way into the shaggy woods, showed a rise and fall of 6 or 8 feet, caused partly by the dam at the outlet. They said that in winter the snow was 3 feet deep on a level here, and sometimes 4 or 5, that the ice on the lake was 2 feet thick, clear, and 4 feet including the snow ice. Ice had already formed in vessels. We lodged here this Sunday night in a comfortable bedroom, apparently the best one, and all that I noticed unusual in the night, for I still kept taking notes like a spy in the camp, was the creaking of the thin split boards when any of our neighbors stirred. Such were the first rude beginnings of a town. They spoke of the practicability of a winter road to the Moosehead Carry, which would not cost much and would connect them with steam and staging and all the busy world. I almost doubted if the lake would be there, the self-same lake, preserve its form and identity, when the shores should be cleared and settled, as if these lakes and streams, which explorers report never awaited the advent of the citizen. The sight of one of these frontier houses built of these great logs, whose inhabitants have unflinchingly maintained their ground many summers and winters into the wilderness, reminds me of famous forts like Ticonderoga or Crown Point, which have sustained memorable sieges. They are especially winter quarters, and at this season this one had a partially deserted look, as if the siege were raised a little, the snow banks being melted from it before it, and its garrison accordingly reduced. I think of their daily food as rations. It is called supplies. A Bible and a greatcoat are munitions of war, and a single man seen about the premises is a sentinel on duty. You expect that he will require the countersign, and will perchance take you for Ethan Allen, come to demand the surrender of his fort in the name of the Continental Congress. It is a sort of ranger service. Arnold's expedition is a daily experience with these settlers. They can prove that they were out at almost any time, and I think that all the first generation of them deserve a pension more than any that went to the Mexican War. Early the next morning we started on our return up the Penobscot, my companion wishing to go about 25 miles above the Moosehead Carry to a camp near the junction of the two forks, and look for moose there. Our host allowed us something for the quarter of the moose which we had brought, and which he was glad to get. 2 explorers from Chamberlain Lake started at the same time that we did. Red flannel shirts should be worn in the woods, if only for the fine contrast which this color makes with the evergreens and the water. Thus, I thought when I saw the forms of the explorers in their birch, poling up the rapids before us far off against the forest. It is the surveyor's color also, most distinctly seen under all circumstances. We stopped to dine at Ragmuff, as before. My companion it was who wandered up the stream to look for moose this time, while Joe went to sleep on the bank, so that we felt sure of him, and I improved the opportunity to botanize and bathe. Soon after starting again, while Joe was gone back in the canoe for the frying pan, which had been left, we picked a couple of quarts of tree cranberries for a sauce. I was surprised by Joe's asking me how far it was to the Moosehorn. He was pretty well acquainted with this stream, but he had noticed that I was curious about distances and had several maps. He and Indians generally with whom I have talked are not able to describe dimensions or distances in our measures with any accuracy. He could tell, perhaps, at what time we should arrive, but not how far it is. We saw a few wood ducks, sheldrakes, and black ducks, but they were not so numerous there at that season as on our river at home. We scared the same family of wood ducks before us, going and returning. We also heard the note of one fishhawk, somewhat like that of a pigeon woodpecker, and soon after saw him perched near the top of a dead white pine against the island where he had first camped, while a company of peetweets were twittering and teetering about over the carcass of a moose on a low sandy spit just beneath. We drove the fishhawk from perch to perch, each time eliciting a scream or whistle, for many miles before us. Our course being upstream, we were obliged to work much harder than before and had frequent use for a pole. Sometimes all three of us had paddled together, standing up, small and heavily laden as the canoe was. About 6 miles from Moosehead, we began to see the mountains east of the north end of the lake, and at 4 o'clock we reached the carry. The Indians were still encamped here. There were 3, including the St. Francis Indian who had come in the steamer with us. One of the others was called Sabattis. Joe and the St. Francis Indian were plainly clear Indian, the other 2 apparently mixed Indian and white, but the difference was confined to their features and complexions, for all that I could see. We here cooked the tongue of the moose for supper, having left the nose, which is esteemed the choicest part, at Chesuncook, boiling, it being a good deal of trouble to prepare it. We also stewed our tree cranberries, Viburnum opulus, sweetening them with sugar. The lumberers sometimes cook them with molasses. They were used in Arnold's expedition. This sauce was very grateful to us who had been confined to hard bread, pork, and moose meat, and notwithstanding their seeds, we all 3 pronounced them equal to the common cranberry. But perhaps some allowance is to be made for our forest appetites. It would be worth the while to cultivate them, both for beauty and for food. I afterwards saw them in a garden in Bangor. Joe said that they were called a beeminer. While we were getting supper, Joe commenced curing the moose hide, on which I had sat a good part of the voyage, he having already cut most of the hair off with his knife at the Quacomgamok. He set up 2 stout forked poles on the bank, 7 or 8 feet high, and as much asunder east and west, and having cut slits 8 or 10 inches long, and the same distance apart, close to the edge, on the sides of the hide, he threaded poles through them, and then, placing one of the poles on the forked stakes, tied the other down tightly at the bottom. The 2 ends also were tied with cedar bark, their usual string, to the upright poles through small holes at short intervals. The hide, thus stretched and slanted a little to the north to expose its flesh side to the sun, measured in the extreme 8 feet long by 6 high. Where any flesh still adhered, Joe boldly scored it with his knife to lay it open to the sun. It now appeared somewhat spotted and injured by the duck shot. You may see the old frames on which hides have been stretched at many camping places in these woods. For some reason or other, the going to the forks of the Penobscot was given up, and we decided to stop here, my companion intending to hunt down the stream at night. The Indians invited us to lodge with them, but my companion inclined to go to the log camp on the carry. This camp was close and dirty and had an ill smell, and I preferred to accept the Indians' offer if we did not make a camp for ourselves. For though they were dirty, too, they were more in the open air, and were much more agreeable and even refined company than the lumberers. The most interesting question entertained at the lumberers' camp was, which man could handle any other on the carry? And for the most part they possessed no qualities which you could not lay hands on. So we went to the Indians' camp or wigwam. It was rather windy, and therefore Joe concluded to hunt after midnight. If the wind went down, which the other Indians thought it would not do, because it was far from the south. The two mixed bloods, however, went off up the river for moose at dark, before we arrived at their camp. This Indian camp was a slight, patched-up affair, which had stood there several weeks, built shed fashion, open to the fire on the west. If the wind changed, they could turn it around. It was formed by two forked stakes and a crossbar, with rafters slanted from this to the ground. The covering was partly an old sail, partly birch bark, quite imperfect, but securely tied on and coming down to the ground on the sides. A large log was rolled up at the backside for a headboard, and 2 or 3 moose hides were spread on the ground with the hair up. Various articles of their wardrobe were tucked around the sides and corners or under the roof. They were smoking moose meat on just such a crate as is represented by with Indebry's Collectio Peregrinatianum, published in 1588, and which the natives of Brazil called bucan, whence buccaneer, on which were frequently shown pieces of human flesh drying along with the rest. It was erected in front of the camp over the usual large fire in the form of an oblong square. 2 stout forked stakes, 4 or 5 feet apart and 5 feet high, were driven into the ground at each end, and then 2 poles, 10 feet long, were stretched across over the fire, and smaller ones laid transversely on these a foot apart. On the last hung large, thin slices of moose meat smoking and drying, a space being left open over the center of the fire. There was the whole heart, black as a 32-pound ball, hanging at one corner. They said that it took 3 or 4 days to cure this meat, and it would keep a year or more. Refuse pieces lay about on the ground in different stages of decay, and some pieces also in the fire, half buried and sizzling in the ashes, as black and dirty as an old shoe. These last I at first thought were thrown away, but afterwards found that they were being cooked. Also, a tremendous rib piece was roasting before the fire, being impaled on an upright stake, forced in and out between the ribs. There was a moose hide, stretched and curing on poles like ours, and quite a pile of cured skins close by. They had killed 22 moose within 2 months, but as they could use but very little of the meat, they left the carcasses on the ground. Altogether, it was about as savage a sight as was ever witnessed, and I was carried back at once 300 years. There were many torches of birch bark, shaped like straight tin horns, lying ready for use on a stump outside. For fear of dirt, we spread our blankets over their hides, so as not to touch them anywhere. The St. Francis Indian and Joe alone were there at first, and we lay on our backs talking with them till midnight. They were very sociable, and when they did not talk with us, kept up a steady chatting in their own language. We heard a small bird just after dark, which Joe said sang at a certain hour in the night, at 10 o'clock, he believed. We also heard the hyloids and tree toads and the lumberers singing in their camp a quarter of a mile off. I told them that I had seen pictured in old books pieces of human flesh drying on these crates, whereupon they repeated some tradition about the Mohawks eating human flesh, what parts they preferred, etc., and also of a battle with the Mohawks near Moosehead, in which many of the latter were killed. But I found that they knew but little of the history of their race, and could be entertained by stories about their ancestors as readily as any. At first I was nearly roasted out, for I lay against one side of the camp and felt the heat reflected not only from the birch bark above, but from the side. And again I remembered the sufferings of the Jesuit missionaries and what extremes of heat and cold the Indians were said to endure. I struggled long between my desire to remain and talk with them, and my impulse to rush out and stretch myself on the cool grass. And when I was about to take the last step, Joe, hearing my murmurs, or else being uncomfortable himself, got up and partially dispersed the fire. I suppose that is Indian manners, to defend yourself. While lying there listening to the Indians, I amused myself with trying to guess at their subject by their gestures or some proper name introduced. There can be no more startling evidence of their being a distinct and comparatively aboriginal race than to hear this unaltered Indian language, which the white man cannot speak nor understand. We may suspect change and deterioration in almost every other particular, but the language which is so wholly unintelligible to us. It took me by surprise, though. I had found so many arrowheads and convinced me that the Indian was not the invention of historians and poets. It was a purely wild and primitive American sound, as much as the barking of a chickaree, and I could not understand a syllable of it. But Paugus, had he been there, would have understood it. These Abenakis gossiped, laughed, and jested in the language in which Eliot's Indian Bible is written, the language which has been spoken in New England who shall say how long. These were the sounds that issued from the wigwams of this country before Columbus was born. They have not yet died away, and with remarkably few exceptions, the language of their forefathers is still copious enough for them. I felt that I stood, or rather lay, as near to the primitive man of America that night as any of its discoverers did. In the midst of their conversation, Joe suddenly appealed to me to know how long Moosehead Lake was. Meanwhile, as we lay there, Joe was making and trying his horn to be ready for hunting after midnight. The St. Francis Indian also amused himself with sounding it, or rather calling through it, for the sound is made with the voice and not by blowing through the horn. The latter appeared to be a speculator in moose hides. He bought my companions for $2.25 green. Joe said that it was worth 2.50 at Old Town. Its chief use is for moccasins. One or two of these Indians wore them. I was told that, by a recent law of Maine, foreigners are not allowed to kill moose there at any season. White Americans can kill them only at a particular season, but the Indians of Maine at all seasons. The St. Francis Indian accordingly asked my companion for a wighiggin, or bill, to show, since he was a foreigner. He lived near Sorrel. I found that he could write his name very well, Tamont Swayson. One Ellis, an old white man of Guilford, a town through which we passed not far from the south end of Moosehead, was the most celebrated moose hunter of those parts. Indians and whites spoke with equal respect of him. Tamont said that there were more moose here than in the Adirondack country in New York, where he had hunted. That 3 years before there were a great many about, and there were a great many now in the woods, but they did not come out to the water. It was of no use to hunt them at midnight. They would not come out. I asked Sabattis, after he came home, if the moose never attacked him. He answered that you must not fire many times so as to madden him. I fire once and hit him in the right place, and in the morning I find him. He won't go far. But if you keep firing, you mad him. I fired once 5 bullets, every one through the heart, and he did not mind 'em at all. It only made him more mad. I asked him if they did not hunt them with dogs. He said that they did so in winter, but never in the summer, for then it was of no use. They would run right off straight and swiftly 100 miles. Another Indian said that the moose, once scared, would run all day. A dog will hang to their lips and be carried along till he is swung against a tree and drops off. They cannot run on a glaze, though they can run in snow 4 feet deep, but the caribou can run on ice. They commonly find 2 or 3 moose together. They cover themselves with water, all but their noses, to escape flies. He had the horns of what he called the black moose that goes in lowlands. These spread 3 or 4 feet. The red moose was another kind, running on mountains, and had horns which spread 6 feet. Such were his distinctions. Both can move their horns. The broad, flat blades are covered with hair and are soft when the animal is alive, that you can run a knife through them. They regard it as a good or bad sign if the horns turn this way or that. His caribou horns had been gnawed by mice in his wigwam, but he thought that the horns neither of the moose nor of the caribou were ever gnawed while the creature was alive, as some have asserted. An Indian whom I met after this at Oldtown, who had carried about a bear and other animals of Maine to exhibit, told me that 30 years ago there were not so many moose in Maine as now. Also, that the moose were very easily tamed and would come back when once fed, and so would deer, but not caribou. The Indians of this neighborhood are about as familiar with moose as we are with ox, having associated with them for so many generations. Father Rasles, in his Dictionary of the Abenaki language, gives not only a word for the male moose, Ayambi, and another for the female, Herer, but for the bone which is in the middle of the heart of the moose, and for his left hind leg. There were none of the small deer up there. They are more common about the settlements. One ran into the city of Bangor 2 years before and jumped through a window of costly plate glass, and then into a mirror, where it thought it recognized one of its kind, and out again, and so on, leaping over the heads of the crowd until it was captured. This the inhabitants speak of as the deer that went a shopping. The last mentioned Indian spoke of the lunxus, or Indian devil, which I take to be the cougar, and not the gulo luscus, as the only animal in Maine which man need fear. It would follow a man and did not mind a fire. He also said that beavers were getting to be pretty numerous again where we went, but their skins brought so little now that it was not profitable to hunt them. I had put the ears of our moose, which were 10 inches long, to dry along with the moose meat over the fire, wishing to preserve them. But Sabattis told me that I must skin and cure them, else the hair would all come off. He observed that they made tobacco pouches out of the skins of the ears, putting the two together inside to inside. I asked him how he got fire, and he produced a little cylindrical box of friction matches. He also had flints and steel, and some punk, which was not dry. I think it was from the yellow birch. Quote, "But suppose you upset and all these and your powder get wet. Then," said he, "we wait till we get to where there is some fire." Unquote. I produced from my pocket a little vial containing matches, stoppled watertight, and told him that though we were upset, We should still have some dry matches, at which he stared without saying a word. We lay awake thus a long while talking, and they gave us the meaning of many Indian names of lakes and streams in the vicinity, especially Tamunt. I asked the Indian name of Moosehead Lake. Joe answered Seboomic. Tamunt pronounced it Sebamook. When I asked what it meant, they answered Moosehead Lake. At length, getting my meaning, they alternately repeated the word over to themselves, as a philologist might. Seboomic, Seboomic, now and then comparing notes in Indian, for there was a slight difference in their dialects, and finally Tamunt said, "Ugh, I know," and he rose up partly on the moose hide. Quote, "Like as here is a place and there is a place," unquote, pointing to different parts of the hide. Quote, "And you take water from there and fill this, and it stays here. That is Seboomic," unquote. I understand him to mean that it was a reservoir of water which did not run away, the river coming in on one side and passing out again near the same place, leaving a permanent bay. Another Indian said that it meant large bay lake, and that Sebago and Sebec, the names of other lakes, were kindred words, meaning large open water. Joe said that Sebuis meant little river. I observed their inability, often described, to convey an abstract idea. Having got the idea, though indistinctly, they groped about in vain for words with which to express it. Tamunt thought that the whites called it Moosehead Lake because Mount Kineo, which commands it, is shaped like a moose's head, and that Moose River was so called because the mountain points right across the lake to its mouth. John Jocelyn, writing about 1673, says, quote, 12 miles from Casco Bay and passable for men and horses is a lake called by the Indians Sebug. On the brink thereof, at one end, is the famous rock, shaped like a moose deer or helk, diaphanous, and called the Moose Rock, unquote. He appears to have confounded Seboomic with Sebago, which is nearer but has no diaphanous rock on its shore. I give more of their definitions for what they are worth, partly because they differ sometimes from the commonly received ones. They never analyzed these words before. After long deliberation and repeating of the word, for it gave much trouble, Tamunt said that Chesuncook meant a place where many streams emptied in, and he enumerated them: Penobscot, Umbazooksas, Kazabessex, Redbrook, etc. Kakamgamak. What does that mean? What are those large white birds? He asked. Gulls, said I. Ugh, Gull Lake. Pamadumcook, Joe thought, meant the lake with gravelly bottom or bed. Kinduskeag, Tamunt concluded at last, after asking if birches went up it, for he said that he was not much acquainted with it, meant something like this: you go up Penobscot till you come to Kinduskeag, and you go by, you don't turn up there. That is Kinduskeag. Another Indian, however, who knew the river better, told us afterward that it meant Little Eel River. Mattawamkeag was a place where two rivers meet. Penobscot was Rocky River. One writer says that this was originally the name of only a section of the main channel, from the head of the tidewater to a short distance above Old Town. A very intelligent Indian, whom we afterward met, son-in-law of Neptune, gave us also these other definitions: Umbazookskas, meadow stream; Millinocket, place of islands. Aboljarkamigas, smooth ledge falls, and dead water. Aboljarkamigas cook, the stream emptying in. The last was the word he gave when he asked about Aboljarknagjesik, which he did not recognize. Mattahumkeg, Sand Creek Pond. Piscataquis, branch of a river. I asked our hosts what Musketaquid, the Indian name of Concord, Massachusetts, meant, but they changed it to Musketacook and repeated that, and Tamont said that it meant dead stream, which is probably true. Cook appears to mean stream, and perhaps quid signifies the place or ground. When I asked the meaning of the names of two of our hills, they answered that they were another language. As Tamont said that he traded at Quebec, my companion inquired the meaning of the word Quebec, about which there has been so much question. He did not know, but began to conjecture. He asked what those great ships were called that carried soldiers. Men of war, we answered. Well, he said, when the English ships came up the river, they could not go any farther. It was so narrow there. They must go back. Go back. That's Quebec. I mentioned this to show the value of his authority in the other cases. Late at night, the other two Indians came home from moose hunting. Not having been successful, aroused the fire again, lighted their pipes, smoked a while, took something strong to drink, and ate some moose meat, and, finding what rooms they could, lay down on the moose hides, and thus we passed the night, 2 white men and 4 Indians side by side. When I awoke in the morning, the weather was drizzling. One of the Indians was lying outside, rolled in his blanket, on the opposite side of the fire for want of room. Joe had neglected to awake my companion, and he had done no hunting that night. Tamont was making a crossbar for his canoe with a singularly shaped knife, such as I have seen since other Indians using. The blade was thin, about 3/4 of an inch wide, and 8 or 9 inches long, but curved out of its plane into a hook, which he said made it more convenient to shave with. As the Indians very far north and northwest use the same kind of knife, I suspect that it was made according to an aboriginal pattern, though some white artisan may use a similar one. The Indians baked a loaf of flour bread and a spider on its edge before the fire for their breakfast, and while my companion was making tea, I caught a dozen sizable fish in the Penobscot, 2 kinds of sucker, and 1 trout. After we had breakfasted by ourselves, one of our bedfellows, who had also breakfasted, came along and, being invited, took a cup of tea, and finally, taking up the common platter, licked it clean. But he, who was nothing to a white fellow, a lumberer who was continually stuffing himself with the Indians' moose meat, and was the butt of his companions accordingly. He seems to have thought that it was a feast to eat all. It is commonly said that the white man finally surpasses the Indian on his own ground, and it was proved true in this case. I cannot swear to his employment during the hours of darkness, but I saw him at it again as soon as it was light, though he came 1/4 of a mile to his work. The rain prevented our continuing any longer in the woods, so giving some of our provisions and utensils to the Indians, we took leave of them. This being the steamer's day, I set out for the lake at once. I walked over the carry alone and waited at the head of the lake. An eagle or some other large bird flew screaming away from its perch by the shore at my approach. For an hour after I reached the shore, there was not a human being to be seen, and I had all that wide prospect to myself. I thought that I had heard the sound of the steamer before she came in sight on the open lake. I noticed at the landing, when the steamer came in, one of our bedfellows, who had been a moose hunting the night before, now very sprucely dressed in a clean white shirt and fine black pants, a true Indian dandy, who had evidently come over the Carry to show himself to any arrivers on the north shore of Moosehead Lake, just as New York dandies take a turn up Broadway and stand on the steps of a hotel. Midway the lake we took on board two manly-looking middle-aged men, with their Bateau, who had been exploring for 6 weeks as far as the Canada line, and had let their beards grow. They had the skin of a beaver, which they had recently caught, stretched on an oval hoop, though the fur was not good at that season. I talked with one of them, telling him that I had come all this distance, partly to see where the white pine, the eastern stuff of which our houses are built, grew, but that on this and a previous excursion into another part of Maine I had found it a scarce tree, and I asked him where I must look for it. With a smile he answered that he could hardly tell me. However, he said that he had found enough to employ 2 teams the next winter in a place where there was thought to be none left. What was considered a tip-top tree now was not looked at 20 years ago when he first went into the business, but they succeeded very well now with what was considered quite inferior timber then. The explorer used to cut into a tree higher and higher up to see if it was false-hearted, and if there was a rotten heart as big as his arm, he let it alone. But now they cut such a tree and sawed it all around the rot, and it made the very best of boards, for in such a case they were never shaky. One connected with lumbering operations at Bangor told me that the largest pine belonged to his firm, cut the previous winter, scaled in the woods 4,500 feet, and was worth $90 on the log at the Bangor boom in Old Town. They cut a road 3.5 miles long for this tree alone. He thought that the principal locality for the white pine that came down the Penobscot now was at the head of the East Branch and the Allagash, about Webster Stream and Eagle and Chamberlain Lakes. Much timber has been stolen from the public lands. Pray, what kind of forest warden is the public itself? I heard of one man who, having discovered some particularly fine trees just within the boundaries of the public lands, and not daring to employ an accomplice, cut them down, and by means of block and tackle, without cattle, tumbled them into a stream, and so succeeded in getting off with them without the least assistance. Surely stealing pine trees in this way is not so mean as robbing hen roosts. We reached Monson that night, and the next day rode to Bangor, all the way in the rain again, varying our route a little. Some of the taverns on this road, which were particularly dirty, were plainly in a transition state from the camp to the house. The next forenoon we went to Old Town. One slender old Indian on the Old Town shore, who recognized my companion, was full of mirth and gestures like a Frenchman. A Catholic priest crossed to the island in the same bateau with us. The Indian houses are framed, mostly of one story, and in rows one behind another, at the south end of the island, with a few scattered ones. I counted about 40, not including the church and what my companion called the council house. The last, which I suppose is their townhouse, was regularly framed and shingled like the rest. There were several of 2 stories, quite neat, with front yards enclosed, and one at least had green blinds. Here and there were moose hides stretched and drying about them. There were no cart paths, no tracks of horses, but footpaths, very little land cultivated, but an abundance of weeds, indigenous and naturalized, more introduced weeds than useful vegetables, as the Indian is said to cultivate the vices rather than the virtues of the white man. Yet this village was cleaner than I expected, far cleaner than such Irish villages as I have seen. The children were not particularly ragged or dirty. The little boys met us with bow in hand and arrow on string, and cried, "Put up a cent." Verily, the Indian has but a feeble hold on his bow now. But the curiosity of the white man is insatiable, and from the first he has been eager to witness this forest accomplishment. That elastic piece of wood with its feathered dart, so sure to be unstrung by contact with civilization, will serve for the type, the coat of arms of the savage. Alas for the hunter race! The white man has driven off their game and substituted a scent in its place. I saw an Indian woman washing at the water's edge. She stood on a rock, and after dipping the clothes in the stream, laid them on the rock and beat them with a short club. In the graveyard, which was crowded with graves and overrun with weeds, I noticed an inscription in Indian painted on a wooden grave board. There was a large wooden cross on the island. Since my companion knew him, we called on Governor Neptune, who lived in a little 10-footer, one of the humblest of them all. Personalities are allowable in speaking of public men, therefore I will give the particulars of our visit. He was abed. When we entered the room, which was one half of the house, he was sitting on the side of the bed. There was a clock hanging in one corner. He had on a black frock coat and black pants, much worn, white cotton shirt, socks, a red silk handkerchief about his neck, and a straw hat. His black hair was only slightly grayed. He had very broad cheeks, and his features were decidedly and refreshingly different from those of any of the upstart Native American party whom I have seen. He was no darker than many old white men. He told me that he was 89, but he was going a moose hunting that fall, as he had been the previous one. Probably his companions did the hunting. We saw various squaws dodging about. One sat on the bed by his side and helped him out with his stories. They were remarkably corpulent, with smooth, round faces, apparently full of good humor. Certainly our much-abused climate had not dried up their adipose substance. While we were there, for we stayed a good while, one went over to Old Town, returned, and cut out a dress which she had bought on another bed in the room. The governor said that he could remember when the moose were much larger, that they did not used to be in the woods, but came out of the water as all deer did. Moose was whale once. Away down Merrimack Way, a whale came ashore in a shallow bay. Sea went out and left him, and he came up on land a moose. What made them know he was a whale was that at first, before he began to run in bushes, he had no bowels inside, but... And then the squaw, who sat on the bed by his side as the governor's aide and had been putting in a word now and then and confirming the story, asked me what we called that soft thing we find along the seashore. Jellyfish? I suggested. Yes, said he, no bowels, but jellyfish. There may be some truth in what he said about the moose growing larger formerly, for the quaint John Jocelyn, a physician who spent many years in this very district in Maine in the 17th century, says that the tips of their horns are sometimes found to be 2 fathoms asunder, and he is particular to tell us that a fathom is 6 feet, and they are in height from the toe of the forefoot to the pitch of the shoulder 12 foot, both which hath been taken by some of my skeptic readers to be monstrous lies. And he adds, there are certain transcendentia in every creature, which are the indelible character of God, and which discover God. This is a greater dilemma to be caught in than is present by the cranium of the young Bechuana ox, apparently another of the transcendentia in the collection of Thomas Steele, Upper Brook Street, London, whose, quote, entire length of horn from tip to tip along the curve is 13 feet 5 inches. Distance straight between the tips of the horns, 8 feet 8.5 inches, unquote. However, the size both of the moose and cougar, as I have found, is generally rather underrated than overrated, and I should be inclined to add the popular estimate a part of what I subtracted from Jocelyn's. But we talked mostly with the governor's son-in-law, a very sensible Indian, and the governor, being so old and deaf, permitted himself to be ignored while we asked questions about him. The former said that there were 2 political parties among them, one in favor of schools and the other opposed to them, or rather they did not wish to resist the priest who was opposed to them. The first had just prevailed at the election and sent their man to the legislature. Neptune and Etienne and he himself were in favor of schools. He said, if Indians got learning, they would keep their money. When we asked where Joe's father, Etienne, was, he knew that he must be at Lincoln, though he was about going a moose hunting, for a messenger had just gone to him there to get his signature to some papers. I asked Neptune if they had any of the old breed of dogs yet. He answered yes, but that, said I, pointing to one that had just come in, is a Yankee dog. He assented. I said that he did not look like a good one. Oh yes, he said, and he told with much gusto how the year before he had caught and held by the throat a wolf. A very small black puppy rushed into the room and made at the governor's feet as he sat in his stockings with his legs dangling from the bedside. The governor rubbed his hands and dared him to come on, entering into the sport with spirit. Nothing more that was significant transpired. To my knowledge, during this interview, this was the first time that I ever called on a governor, but as I did not ask for an office, I can speak of it with the more freedom. An Indian who was making canoes behind a house, looking up pleasantly from his work, for he knew my companion, said that his name was Old John Pennyweight. I had heard of him long before, and I inquired after one of his contemporaries, Joe 4d halfpenny, but alas, he no longer circulates. I made a faithful study of canoe building, and I thought that I should like to serve an apprenticeship at that trade for one season, going into the woods for bark with my boss, making the canoe there and returning in at last. While the Bateau was coming over to take us off, I picked up some fragments of arrowheads on the shore and one broken stone chisel, which were greater novelties to the Indians than to me. After this, an old Fort Hill at the bend of the Penobscot, 3 miles above Bangor, looking for the site of an Indian town which some think stood thereabouts. I found more arrowheads and 2 little dark and crumbling fragments of Indian earthenware in the ashes of their fires. The Indians on the island appeared to live quite happily and to be well treated by the inhabitants of Old Town. We visited Vesey's Mills, just below the island, where were 16 sets of saws, some gang saws, 16 in a gang, not to mention circular saws. On one side, they were hauling the logs up an inclined plane by water power. On the other, passing out the boards, planks, and sawed timber and forming them into rafts. The trees were literally drawn and quartered there. In forming the rafts, they used the lower 3 feet of the hardwood saplings, which have a crooked and knobbed butt end, for bolts, passing them up through holes bored in the corners and sides of the rafts and keying them. In another apartment, they were making fence slats, such as stand all over New England, out of odds and ends, and it may be that I saw where the picket fence behind which I dwell at home came from. I was surprised to find a boy collecting the long edging of boards as fast as cut off and thrusting them down a hopper where they were ground up beneath the mill, that they might be out of the way. Otherwise, they accumulate in vast piles by the side of the building, increasing the danger from fire, or floating off, they obstruct the river. This was not only a sawmill, but a gristmill then. The inhabitants of Old Town, Stillwater, and Bangor cannot suffer for want of kindling stuff, surely. Some get their living exclusively by picking up the driftwood and selling it by the cord in the winter. In one place I saw where an Irishman, who keeps a team and a man for the purpose, had covered the shore for a long distance with regular piles, and I was told that he had sold $1,200 worth in a year. Another, who lived by the shore, told me that he got all the material of his outbuildings and fences from the river, and in that neighborhood I perceived that this refuse wood was frequently used instead of sand to fill hollows with, being apparently cheaper than dirt. I got my first clear view of Katahdin on this excursion from a hill about 2 miles northwest of Bangor, whither I went for this purpose. After this, I was ready to return to Massachusetts. Humboldt has written an interesting chapter on the primitive forest, but no one has yet described for me the difference between that wild forest which once occupied our oldest townships and the tame one which I find there today. It is a difference which would be worth attending to. The civilized man not only clears the land permanently to a great extent and cultivates open fields, but he tames and cultivates to a certain extent the forest itself. By his mere presence, almost, he changes the nature of the trees as no other creature does. The sun and air and perhaps fire have been introduced and grain raised where it stands. It has lost its wild, damp, and shaggy look. The countless fallen and decaying trees are gone, and consequently that thick coat of moss which lived on them is gone too. The earth is comparatively bare and smooth and dry. The most primitive places left with us are the swamps, where the spruce still grows shaggy with usnea. The surface of the ground in the Maine woods is everywhere spongy and saturated with moisture. I notice that the plants which cover the forest floor there are such as are commonly confined to swamps with us. The Clintonia borealis, orchises, creeping snowberry, and others, and the prevailing aster. There is the aster acuminatus, which with us grows in damp and shady woods. The asters cordifolius and macrophyllus also are common, asters of little or no color, and sometimes without petals. I saw no soft, spreading second growth, white pines with smooth bark acknowledging the presence of the woodchopper, but even the young white pines were all tall and slender rough-barked trees. Those Maine woods differ essentially from ours. There you are never reminded that the wilderness which you are threading is, after all, some villager's familiar woodlot, some widow's thirds, from which our ancestors have sledded fuel for generations, minutely described in some old deed which is recorded, of which the owner has got a plan too, and old bound marks may be found every 40 rods if you will search. 'Tis true, the map may inform you that you stand on land granted by the state to some academy, or on Bingham's purchase. But these names do not impose on you, for you see nothing to remind you of the academy or of Bingham. What were the forests of England to these? One writer relates of the Isle of Wight that in Charles the second time, quote, there were woods in the island so complete and extensive that it is said a squirrel might have travelled in several parts many leagues together on the top of the trees, unquote. If it were not for the rivers, and he might go round their heads, a squirrel could here travel thus the whole breadth of the country. We have as yet had no adequate account of a primitive pine forest. I have noticed that in a physical atlas lately published in Massachusetts and used in our schools, the woodland of North America is limited almost solely to the valleys of the Ohio and some of the Great Lakes, and the great pine forests of the globe are not represented. In our vicinity, for instance, New Brunswick and Maine are exhibited as bare as Greenland. It may be that the children of Greenville at the foot of Moosehead Lake, who surely are not likely to be scared by an owl, are referred to the valley of the Ohio to get an idea of a forest. But they would not know what to do with their moose, bear, caribou, beaver, etc. there. Shall we leave it to an Englishman to inform us that, quote, in North America, both in the United States and Canada, are the most extensive pine forests in the world, unquote? The greater part of New Brunswick, the northern half of Maine, and adjacent parts of Canada, not to mention the northeastern part of New York and other tracts further off, are still covered with an almost unbroken pine forest. But Maine, perhaps, will soon be where Massachusetts is. A good part of her territory is already as bare and commonplace as much of our neighborhood, and her villages generally are not so well shaded as ours. We seem to think that the earth must go through the ordeal of sheep pasturage before it is habitable by man. Consider Nahant, the resort of all the fashion of Boston, which peninsula I saw but indistinctly in the twilight when I steamed by it, and thought that it was unchanged since the discovery. John Smith described it in 1614 as the Mattahunts, two pleasant isles of groves, gardens, and cornfields, and others tell us that it was once well wooded and even furnished timber to build the wharves of Boston. Now it is difficult to make a tree grow there, and the visitor comes away with a vision of Mr. Tudor's ugly fences a rod high, designed to protect a few pear shrubs. And what are we coming to in our Middlesex towns? A bald, staring town-house or meeting-house, and bare Liberty Pole as leafless as it is fruitless, for all I can see. We shall be obliged to import the timber for the last hereafter, or splice such sticks as we have. And our ideas of liberty are equally mean with these. The very willow rose lopped every 3 years for fuel or powder, and every sizable pine and oak or other forest tree cut down within the memory of man, as if individual speculators were to be allowed to export the clouds out of the sky or the stars out of the firmament one by one. We shall be reduced to gnaw the very crust of the earth for nutriment. They have even descended to smaller game. They have lately, as I hear, invented a machine for chopping up huckleberry bushes fine, and so converting them into fuel. bushes which for fruit alone are worth all the pear trees in the country many times over. I can give you a list of the 3 best kinds if you want it. At this rate, we shall all be obliged to let our beards grow at least, if only to hide the nakedness of the land and make a sylvan appearance. The farmer sometimes talks of brushing up, simply as if bare ground looked better than clothed ground, than that which wears its natural vesture, as if the wild hedges, which perhaps are more to his children than his whole farm beside, were dirt. I know of one who deserves to be called the tree-hater, and perhaps to leave this for a new patronymic to his children. You would think that he had been warned by an oracle that he would be killed by the fall of a tree, and so was resolved to anticipate them. The journalists think that they cannot say too much in favor of such improvements in husbandry. It is a safe theme like piety, but as for the beauty of one of these model farms, I would as lief see a patent churn and a man turning it. They are commonly places merely where somebody is making money. It may be counterfeiting. The virtue of making 2 blades of grass grow where only 1 grew before does not begin to be superhuman. Nevertheless, it was a relief to get back to our smooth but still varied landscape. For a permanent residence, it seemed to me that there could be no comparison between this and the wilderness, necessary as the latter is for the resource and a background, the raw material of all our civilization. The wilderness is simple almost to barrenness. The partially cultivated country it is which chiefly has inspired, and will continue to inspire, the strains of poets, such as compose the mass of any literature. Our woods are sylvan, and their inhabitants woodsmen and rustics, that is, selvagia, and the inhabitants are salvages. A civilized man, using the word in the ordinary sense with his ideas and associations, must at length pine there like a cultivated plant, which clasps its fibers about a crude and undissolved mass of peat. At the extreme north, the voyagers are obliged to dance and act plays for employment. Perhaps our own woods and fields, in the best wooded towns, where we need not quarrel about the huckleberries, with the primitive swamps scattered here and there in their midst, but not prevailing over them, are the perfection of parks and groves, gardens, arbors, paths, vistas, and landscapes. They are the natural consequence of what art and refinement we as a people have. The common, which each village possesses, its true paradise, in comparison with which all elaborately and wilfully well-constructed parks and gardens are paltry imitations. Or, I would rather say, such were our groves 20 years old. The poet's commonly is not a logger's path, but a woodman's. The logger and pioneer have preceded him, like John the Baptist, eaten the wild honey, it may be, but the locusts also, banished decaying wood and the spongy mosses which feed on it, and built hearths and humanized nature for him. But there are spirits of a yet more liberal culture to whom no simplicity is barren. There are not only stately pines, but fragile flowers like the orchises, commonly described as too delicate for cultivation, which derive their nutriment from the crudest mass of peat. These remind us that not only for strength, but for beauty, the poet must from time to time travel the logger's path and the Indian's trail to drink at some new and more bracing fountain of the muses, far in the recesses of the wilderness. The kings of England formerly had their forests to hold the king's game, for sport or food, sometimes destroying villages to create or extend them. And I think that they were impelled by a true instinct. Why should not we, who have renounced the king's authority, have our national preserves, where no villages need be destroyed, in which the bear and panther and some even the hunter race may still exist, and not be civilized off the face of the earth? Our forests, not to hold the king's game merely, but to hold and preserve the king himself also, the Lord of creation, not for idle sport or food, but for inspiration and our own true recreation? Or shall we, like the villains, grub them up, poaching on our own national domains?